They laughed as they dumped me at the nursing home, Antonio thought, though the words lodged in his throat as if someone had tied them there. He could still hear the laughter, high, brittle, careless, mixed with the clack of car doors and the low whine of the engine as it pulled away. The courtyard smelled of disinfectant and chrysanthemums. A security light blinked. A nurse glanced over with professional unease and then turned her head, busy with a clipboard. Behind the glass doors, the world moved on. Antonio's hand closed around Rosa's fingers. The skin on both of their hands was a map of years. Grooves and calluses, little white moons where nails had snagged fabric, faint scars like punctuation marks. His thumb stroked the soft pad by her knuckle, the motion automatic as if it could smooth the whole disgrace away. Rosa's eyes were quiet, not the angry kind of quiet, but the weary one that had learned to survive storms by simply keeping house inside herself. Across the pavement, Marcelo's shoulders were loose with relief. Patricia's mouth twisted the way it always did when she wanted pity but not responsibility. Bruno laughed again, louder this time, turning his face toward the street as if he had nothing to hide. They put down 2 worn suitcases, as if leaving a parcel on a stoop. Patricia adjusted the strap of her handbag and with perfect, practiced indifference said, "We can't keep carrying this. It's better for them there." The door clicked shut before anyone offered real goodbyes. "Come on," Marcelo urged. "We've got to get to the dealership before the test drive window closes." The car peeled away, and the sound receded like something flung from their lives. Antonio sat on the bench the way a man sits on the edge of a life he no longer recognizes, slowly, with the ballast of memory weighing each movement. He had imagined this moment many ways: sickness, a long, honest discussion, even mortality, but never this: humiliation thinly veiled as concision, abandonment dressed as doing what's best. He watched the asphalt where the license plate had vanished, and thought of 1,000 mornings, sun up over the fields, worn leather in his hands, the smell of coffee at dawn, Rosa's humming from the kitchen. He did not hate them in that bright, volcanic way television sometimes made hatred look. Instead, the laughter lodged in him like a stone, and all the tenderness that had built their life started to ache. Rosa leaned against him, small and steady. "We'll be all right," she whispered, not asking whether it was true, but offering it as a fact that needed to be believed. Antonio nodded because the nod with a language he still knew. He looked down at the suitcases, threadbare, patched, the label from some long-ago trip peeling off. In one of them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather folder he had carried for nearly 40 years. He had buried it at the bottom of the trunk, under sweaters and old tools, as if the things that mattered most should never get dusty or be mistaken for trash. He had kept it secret for reasons that had nothing to do with greed. Secrets, he thought, are sometimes promises to yourself. A young nurse with tired eyes approached. "Sir, are you staying?" she asked, voice careful. Her name tag said Anna. She had seen this before, families who arrived late and left early, who spoke of care and facility the way people speak of necessary procedures. Her hand hovered for a moment before she offered, softly, "We can find a room for you tonight. I'll call social services." Antonio shook his head. "No, thank you." He gathered his courage. "We don't want trouble. We can't turn people away if their family leaves them," Anna said. She glanced at Rosa, at the grip of 2 hands that had raised children and tilled soil, and understood the thinness between hope and humiliation. "If you want, I can call someone. There's a community house on the next street. The owner, Lourdes, sometimes takes in folks until they settle. She makes a mean soup." Her mouth curved into a tired smile that carried no judgment. It was small kindness, but in that courtyard it felt like a raft. Antonio's voice was a dry thread. "Thank you." The nurse dialed a number on her phone as Marcelo and the others merged into the traffic like a sudden memory that refused to be remembered. Patricia wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and did not look back. Bruno put the last suitcase in the trunk and laughed as if the sound could polish the day. The gate clanged shut. Grass whispered in the wind. That evening, Lourdes's house smelled of bay leaves and old wood. Her pension was not ostentatious, just 4 rooms and a common kitchen, but it had the kind of warmth that cradled people who had been wrung by life and needed to be dried out. There was the kettle always on, a fan that clicked like a metronome, and a row of jars with pickled vegetables on the windowsill. When Anna made the call, Lourdes had answered in a voice that didn't ask questions it couldn't carry. She opened the door with a fabric apron tied at her waist and a face like a weathered photograph, lines from decades of laughter and keeping watch. "Come in," she said, as if she had been expecting them since the morning of creation.
She led Antonio and Rosa to a small room with 2 single beds covered in crocheted blankets. A wooden chair sat by the window. A radio in the corner hummed old songs. "You're safe here," Lourdes said. She set a plate of bread and butter on the table and poured coffee into bowls like a ritual. First thing, food. Second thing, rest. Third thing, talk when you're ready. Rosa sat with the coffee cupped in both hands, heat seeping into her palms. Tears did not come as theatrical torrents.
Instead, they arrived as small private betrayals, easing down her cheeks and being absorbed by the crocheted fabric in the same quiet way the house absorbed the day's conversations. Antonio unpacked his things slowly. When his fingers brushed leather beneath wool and shirts, his breath caught. He did not take the folder out. He had always been a man who kept promises to himself in private ways. The folder had been one of those promises. He placed his hand on it through the clothing and felt the edge of time. The next morning, life at Lourdes's was measured in small movements. Another resident, Paulinho, mended fences for a neighbor and told stories about how the town had been built around fig trees and the river that used to run clear. Jessica, who worked part-time in the post office, brought a newspaper and read headlines out loud, as if they needed to be punctuated by someone's voice. A boy named Edelson, no older than 20, swept the steps with a broom and hummed to himself. They moved around Antonio and Rosa like a new protective constellation, each kindness folded in like a blanket. Antonio began to help where he could, fixing broken hinges, sweeping the yard, carrying water. He could still lift heavy things. Even when his back protested, he found that the muscles learned to remember the rhythm of work. The work steadied him like an old prayer. At night, he and Rosa sat on the small porch. The stars were the same ones that watched over their long life together. The town's sound was distant and gentle. When neighbors asked about the children, the couple answered with short sentences and then changed the subject. Their reality was too large for gossip. Evenings were the hardest. Memories slipped in like rainwater through a cracked window. The first time Marcelo's small fingers closed around Antonio's palm. The pride at a report card. The cramped salary when the roof needed mending. Each memory was a splinter of light in the dark. Antonio would take the leather folder from his trunk and sit with it for a while, rubbing the worn corner as if he could smooth out the rough pieces of their life. He had not always intended secrecy. The folder had begun as a place to keep receipts and contracts, small things a man collects over decades. A bill of sale here, a note from a neighbor there. There were letters, one in particular from a distant relative who, years ago, had mentioned a small parcel of land inherited through a marriage that fell apart. The papers were yellowed and stamped, some with signatures he barely remembered, executed in a language of ink and official seals. For a long time, the papers had felt like a story that belonged to someone else. When the town began to change, when new houses rose along the old dirt road, and a developer with glossy pamphlets had driven through years ago, the papers began to feel like a resource, heavy with the weight of possibility. On the third day at Lourdes's, a boy named Edelson came in with a message. A man from the city had asked about Antonio and Rosa. He said he was with the law, Edelson told him, voice low and cautious, as if the world were listening. Said he wanted to meet. Lourdes bristled in the way of someone who had an instinct for when a scent might mean trouble. "We don't sign anything without reading," she said. Her voice carried authority enough to make the boy nod and go back to sweeping. She turned to Antonio. "Do you have papers?" Antonio looked at the leather folder as if it were a sleeping animal. He felt foolish and proud at once. Foolish because of the secrecy, proud because people sometimes guard what they know is fragile. He handed the folder to Lourdes, who opened it with fingers that had once tied shoelaces and later tied the ties of sons going off to war. She flipped through the papers with a low, appreciative hum. "What is it?" Rosa asked, voice trembling. Lourdes folded her lips around a coffee sip and closed her eyes as if tasting the past. "There might be something here," she said slowly, "but I don't know. I'll ask Josue." Josue's truck smelled of diesel and old leather. He drove a route between the market and the nursing home where he worked occasional shifts as a driver and had a habit of keeping his ears open. He had seen things a lot of people preferred not to see, the faces families made when they left, the way children sometimes learn to turn care into chore. When Lourdes called, he arrived at the pension with the quick, practical energy of a man used to creating order in messy moments.
He sat at the kitchen table and unrolled the papers like a cartographer mapping unknown terrain. His calloused hands were steady. "This looks official," Josue said. He tapped a faded map that showed a patch of land with a scribbled boundary and an old notation, CTO Dabaida. The name curled at the edges like a secret. "What do you mean, official?" Antonio asked. Josue leaned his elbows on the table. "Not all old papers mean money. Sometimes they mean memories. Sometimes bureaucracy eats the old ones. But the stamps are real. The signatures look like records. I can ask a friend, Dr. Renato. He helps people with things like this." "Lois Cesares my Antonios." There was a look of cautious hope that had nothing to do with greed. "Don't get your heart racing," she said lightly, though her voice betrayed the tremor of possibility. "But if this is something, we do it right. We go to a lawyer." They did not rush. They were not foolish. Dr. Renato was not a flashy man. He was the sort of lawyer who kept his office tidy and his promises fewer than his bills. When he first held the folder, he frowned the way men do when two realities meet, the legal and the lived. "These papers, some of them came from a time when records were more oral than digital," he explained.
Names get changed, properties get subdivided, and sometimes the only thing that remains is a chain of signatures and witnesses. Do you have anyone to swear to these? He looked up at Antonio. Antonio felt the room narrow to the distance between him and the man he had become. "I signed with my name. I know who sold what to whom. I remember." His voice had the brittle strength of someone who had built a life from the fragments of a world. He could tell the story of each signature: his father's cough in the room at the signing table, the neighbor who had served as witness, the day the ink dried and the world moved on. Dr. Renato set the papers on his desk and opened his laptop. He found aerial photographs of the town from a regional archive. The images were grainy, like old film, but the lines were there: roads, a distant river, and a large, uncultivated patch of land near the outskirts that, in the newer photos, sported subdivisions and a glint of pavement where once there had been fig trees and scrub. He tapped at the screen. "It looks like development has been creeping near this parcel for years," he said. "If your documents are in order, the value could be significant. But I want you to understand, significant often takes time. There are registries, insurance, possibly inheritance claims, depending on how things were left in the intervening years. I don't promise riches tomorrow." He spoke the words with the gravity of a man not used to barter with hopes. This was the moment the title of the story could have been a point of shame or a line of poetry. Alone with the folder in the quiet of his room, Antonio pressed the leather and remembered a different time: a field where his father had once planted a row of corn, the small shack where they had argued about how to feed a family, the sharp, white day his youngest learned to read. The papers had been there all along, quiet as a wild root. He had tucked them away because the world had never asked for more than the sweat of his hands. To suddenly realize those yellow pages could tilt a life into something else, into safety, into choice, felt like the slow dawn after a long night. Word did not move fast in Valle da Esperanza, but when it moved, it arrived like a soft wind that nudged curtains and then people. A neighbor who sold fish at the market mentioned a possible claim over coffee. A post on a local forum, one that Jessica kept tabs on, speculated that a developer had been buying nearby properties in small, unassuming parcels. It was the sort of gossip that carried the scent of danger and opportunity in equal parts. Antonio did not tell anyone about the folder at first. He hid it again, beneath the sweaters in his trunk, as if not speaking the possibility aloud might keep it safe from the barbed nature of hope, where the more you spoke of something, the higher the risk of losing it. But the world is not patient with secrets. The papers had been seen.
Renato had copied the measurements and taken photographs. He explained carefully to Antonio and Rosa, as if discussing the weather, what the next steps might be: a title search, a possible survey, verification at the registry office, and the slow machinery of law that operates on forms, fees, and time. Rosa sat with his hand in hers, listening. "If this is true," she murmured once, "we will not forget who we are." "No," Antonio agreed. "We will not let anyone throw us away twice." Lourdes put a hand on Rosa's shoulder in a gesture that had no words. Josue offered to drive documents to the city when needed. Edelson volunteered to help with errands. The town's kindness circled them like a low, warm tide. Then, one afternoon, a motorbike pulled up to the pension. A young woman with a clipboard dismounted and introduced herself as a representative from the local social services. She had gentle eyes and a way of speaking that made it clear the world was larger and more procedural than their small patch of human drama. "I heard you were here," she said. "We want to make sure you're signed up on our list. There are programs, subsidies. We can help document stability if needed." Antonio declined politely. "Thank you. We're fine here." She looked at the folder on the table, innocently curious. "What's that?" "Old papers," Lourdes said quickly. "For the town, if anything. We're handling it." The woman made a note and, without malice, said, "Sometimes developers are very interested in parcels near new roads. Be careful who you speak to." That evening, after the radio had softened into an old ballad and the pension had settled into the small breathing of a house at night, Antonio took the folder back in his hands. He opened it to the one page he had not shown anyone, a yellowed letter written by a cousin who had emigrated decades ago, mentioning that a piece of land had been left to the family by a grandmother who had owned a little plot on the town's edge. The letter was more like a breadcrumb than a map, partial addresses scribbled along the margin, names that had changed over generations. Yet every name meant a life, and every life meant a thread that could be picked. He thought of how many times he had sat at a cafe and watched new houses go up from the ridge. White walls, glass, a fence that bit the sky. Perhaps one day those houses would overlook something else, a small green courtyard where elders could sit in dignity rather than be set down like another unused object. Perhaps, if the papers held, there would be a way to turn the secret into something public and generous. Antonio slept that night with the folder beneath his pillow. It was a ridiculous habit, perhaps, but it felt like carrying a lantern in dark rooms. Foolishly obvious, strangely reassuring. Morning came, and with it, a new rhythm. He helped fix a locked gate while Lourdes swept the porch.
They talked about small things as if small things were entire maps. The recipe for a stew, the right time to prune a lemon tree, the way to sit with someone who had lost everything without making them smaller for their loss. Life knew how to keep moving, even when the soul wanted to stop and measure every bruise. A week after the discovery, Dr. Renato called with a preliminary update. "The registry is messy," he said, voice wrapped in legal caution. "There are gaps, names that have shifted, a record that was misfiled in 1992. But the surveys and the old aerials line up. I don't want to promise anything, but we should file an official claim and begin regularization. It will take months. There will be fees. There will be witnesses to appear for declarations. It's a process." Antonio listened, his breath short and patient. The folder had changed everything and nothing. The humiliation at the nursing home still hummed in his veins like a broken record, but now it sat beside a new possibility, not revenge, but choice. "We'll do it right," Rosa said. "We won't let shame or anger make the decisions for us." "Good," Dr. Renato said. "Get rest. Gather whoever can remember any detail. Names, transactions, old neighbors, before memories fade. We will need them." They began to collect evidence the way one gathers kindling, small, necessary pieces kept safe in a neat pile for the fire they hoped to make. A neighbor in the market remembered a date and a name. A retired postman recalls a hand that had signed for something in a box. The town's memory was a patchwork, and together it began to form a map again. Even as the legal wheels started to turn, there were other sorts of movement. News likes cracks. It sneaks out as a whisper and then becomes a conversation that must be answered. Rumors reached the ears of Marcelo, Patricia, and Bruno. The siblings met at a cafe not far from the dealership where Marcelo managed sales. They did not mention the nursing home in the beginning. They spoke with an air of boredom about numbers, mortgages, the small annoyances of life. "Did you hear?" Patricia said then, leaning forward as if the tilt of her head could pull the story closer. Bruno's expression shifted in a fraction of a degree. "Probably old deeds. Worth what? Breadcrumbs?" Marcelo, who had been looking at a spreadsheet on his phone, looked up. "If it's something, it's ours. We should make sure it—" "Make sure what?" Patricia snapped. "They abandoned them, Marcelo. You don't think the three of us deserve?" "I'm not saying deserve," Marcelo said quickly, palms flat on the table. "I'm saying we were promised." "You were promised?" Bruno repeated, incredulous. "They raised us. They worked their hands raw. They didn't sell anything. They kept everything. Maybe it's their right." The conversation hung there, a thread barely taut. None of them had time to sit with nuance or guilt. They had small engines to run, businesses, mortgages, the social calendar.
But the world has a way of making questions land where they will. A missing inheritance is like a draft under a door. It finds the spaces where people think they deserve more. Back at the pension, Lourdes and Josue joked about the town's appetite for rumor. People love stories where the poor suddenly get rich, Lourdes said. They want endings that fix the injustices quickly. Josue looked at her and nodded. Maybe they'd rather see a miracle than build a shelter. He laughed, but his eyes were serious. We'll do what's right, Lourdes said. If there's something, we'll turn it into help. A few rooms for people who have nowhere. A place for those falling through cracks. They wanted to leave them at a nursing home like a pair of old shoes. We'll make sure old people have a place that keeps their name. Antonio looked at her, gratitude and something like relief mixing. He had never imagined himself a philanthropist. He had imagined himself a man who had loved a woman and raised children and worked until his bones recognized the shape of the job. The idea of changing the world, of using whatever was in that folder to protect others, was both dizzying and right. The secret inside his leather folder suddenly felt less like a private treasure and more like an obligation. On a late afternoon, as the sky folded into the color of fat coins, Dr. Renato arrived at Lourdes's with folders of his own. He sat at the kitchen table, spread out maps, made copies, and talked about timelines. We'll start with registration, he said. Then we'll survey. I'll speak to a colleague in the registry office. If the developers have already started transactions, we'll need to know. Don't talk to strangers. If someone approaches you with a good offer, come to me first. Antonio listened, feeling the terms like a new language. Registry, survey, regularization. The words were practical and slow-moving, which was what he wanted now, clarity and time. He wanted the world to be fair, but he also wanted his own hands to remain honest. That night, under a thin blanket of stars, Antonio and Rosa sat on the pension's worn step and watched the town inhale and exhale. The radio inside turned up a song that had been their wedding melody long ago, and for a moment, the past and present braided together so tightly it felt like reforming a rope. No promises had been made about the future. No children had returned with open arms. The laughter at the nursing home still grazed the edges of his thoughts. But there was something else too, the steady presence of people who had not abandoned them. The folder under his pillow weighed less now, not because the papers had lost their density, but because they had moved from being a secret kept from the world to a truth that would be carried into the open, gradually, with ceremony and caution.
And somewhere in the city, beyond the river and the newly paved roads, a young man with a neat haircut and a glossy card read a note from his boss. Claudio's letter was crisp, printed with the small confidence of a man who buys and sells land like books on a shelf. His job description included looking for parcels that might be profitable. His eyes were trained to catch the kind of rumor that leads to a meeting with someone who has been tired for a long time and who suddenly has paperwork. He read the local post by a neighbor, just a passing comment on a forum, and marked the name. When a developer's interest smells like profit, it tends to follow the scent with an efficient footstep. Claudio stroked his chin and made a note to send a junior associate to the town to look into the matter. He imagined a quick negotiation, a deal that would be tidy for both sides, a check, a signature, a smooth press release. Business, in his world, was a sequence of steps that leads from a property to a return on investment. He did not imagine the lives stitched into the paper. Back at Lourdes's, the couple slept, but not as entirely as they had once. There was always the sense that something had pivoted, that even now, with the town quiet and the radio hissing softly, change had planted itself in the yard like a small sapling. Antonio dreamed of a road lined with fig trees, of children who learned to keep their elders close, of a community home full of voices rather than the clatter of indifferent doors. Morning would bring more calls, more forms, a surveyor's measuring tape, Dr. Renate careful advice. It would also bring the whisper that becomes a knock at the wrong moment, and a set of faces that do not come because they missed their parents, but because they smelled opportunity. Antonio folded the leather folder and placed it on the bedside table. He touched the corner of a photograph tucked inside, an old picture of him and Rosa on a day that had once felt like forever, and felt how strong a life could be when held in a single hand.
He had been dumped at the nursing home by the people who were supposed to love him. He had been rescued by strangers who invited him into a quiet, living kindness, and in the space between shame and the folder's pages, something like hope had begun to take root. Outside, the town was waking. Somewhere a motorbike hummed. Somewhere a city man adjusted his tie and wrote a note. The story they had not asked for had begun to attract attention. The paper in the leather folder, brittle and slow, would now be read aloud in offices and at kitchen tables. The process would be long, and the cost, emotional, legal, and practical, would be more than any one person could carry. Antonio rose, pulling on his jacket. The day had teeth. He stepped out onto the porch, set his face to the light, and began the small work the day required: making soup, sweeping the yard, learning the names of neighbors who would become, in time, family.
He carried the folder, not as a weapon, but as a tool, and for the first time since the gate had closed at the nursing home, he felt a kind of steadiness that was not resignation. The phone at Lourdes's rang. Edelson answered, voice tentative. He listened. Then his expression changed. "A woman from the registry office is on the line," he said. "She wants to confirm some details. She asked if anyone could come in person." Dr. Renato looked up. "Tell her I'll be there as soon as possible." Antonio felt his heart do a curious thing. It leapt into his throat, not with fear, but with expectation. The leather folder was a sleeping thing no longer. It had been seen. The town had noticed. The world, with all its indifferent gears, had engaged. On the other side of town, Marcelo refreshed his phone as if new messages might be a map. Patricia scrolled through her feed. Bruno called a friend to ask about legal advice. They had heard things, and when you have been trained to find profit in rumor, you begin to move. Lourdes poured coffee into 3 mugs. Dr. Renato folded his hands around the warm ceramic and said softly, "Whatever happens, we do this by the book. No quick deals, no pressure." Antonio nodded. "We'll do it our way." He thought of Rosa's steady eyes and of the hands that had, for so long, made this life possible. He thought of the laughter at the gate and how it had become for him the sharpest kind of memory, a wound that would not define them. They had been dumped like old furniture at a nursing home door, but the truth inside a leather folder had begun to unspool. It would not fix everything. It would not erase the sting, but it might let them choose how to end the story. A car pulled up outside. The engine idled. A figure stepped out, tie crooked, smile ready. Claudio had been sent, as all things like him should be, efficient, curious, and confident that a conversation could make everything neatly disappear into an account balance. Antonio looked at the road and then at Rosa. He straightened his back in the way of a man who had always stood when asked. He took the folder from the bedside, wrapped it in a clean dish towel, and walked toward the door. The first act of a new life, he realized, often began with the decision to open the door. The car that had left them at the gate went on to its clean errands. The town stayed. People unfurled their small mercies like blankets, and the day moved around Antonio and Rosa in a new shape. In the bright pocket of that change, Lourdes's kitchen became the first place where their humiliation was not a footnote, but a story that needed care. If this story is touching something inside you, subscribe for more true human stories. There are more like this out in the world. Days turned into weeks in a soft, careful rhythm. The legal work Dr. Renato described arrived in boxes of forms and ruled lines of time.
Surveyors came with yellow tape measures and the laconic patience of people who read the contours of Earth as if it were a ledger. A clerk in the registry office unfurled a stack of microfilmed records and compared spidery handwriting to the signatures on Antonio's brittle papers. Every success felt incremental, a confirmatory stamp here, a witness declaration there. Each step required money, filing fees, copies, petrol, and someone to go to the city when the registry's hours collided with the rhythms of village life. Josue drove. It did not happen in a burst. There was no cinematic moment when an accountant pushed a check across a mahogany table. There was instead a long series of small fortifications: Dr. Renato's patient negotiations with clerks, the neighbor who remembered a name and wrote it down for the affidavit, Idilson's repeated trips to the municipal office carrying a stack of documents tucked like a sandwich under his arm. The legal process moved like a river that has to be dredged before the current can clear. Meanwhile, The rumor that had nudged Marcelo and his siblings into action swelled into a chorus. Claudio's interest arrived formally: a crisp card, a polite email, a short voicemail asking for a meeting. He sent a junior representative to scout first, a man with neat shoes and an apologetic smile who asked polite questions at Lord's kitchen table, and then left with his notebook closed. Then Claudio himself came, tie straight, hands that did not look like they had ever been cracked by work. He preferred the greenhouse gloss of new developments to the honest wear of hands that plant and harvest. He stood on the pension's threshold with the calm confidence of someone who believed the world existed to be resold. "Mr. Silva," he asked, using the formal address like a slip of paper between his fingers. "I'm Claudio Mendez. I represent Valle Construcciones. We've been eyeing opportunities around Valle de Esperanza. I understand you have a parcel adjacent to a proposed project. I'd like to make a fair offer so you can move on comfortably." Antonio watched him with a careful, even gaze. There was nothing sudden about Claudio's politeness. It had the same economy as a closed contract. Lourdes poured coffee while the men spoke. Rosa kept her hands occupied with the hem of her apron, fingers finding clerical solace in several small, ordinary motions. "How much?" Antonio asked, plain as a nail. Claudio named a number that glittered like a promise. It was polished and polite, and measured enough to imagine lives altered if the math held true. Dr. Renato's eyebrows rose. He reminded everyone of the process: mandatory surveys, a title search, the possibility that others might claim partial rights, tax considerations, municipal approvals. Money, Claudio said, could be an escrow while those details were handled, an offer that made the edges of practicality shine like a mirror. Word of the offer walked faster than the legal work.
Marcelo's phone lit up with messages, and he and his siblings arranged a meeting at the tea room, where marble tables hosted conversations about accounts and appetites. They spoke less about the small, raw hurt of leaving parents at a nursing home, and more about the arithmetic of entitlement. "We should be part of the negotiation," Marcelo insisted. "It's our family, too." Patricia's voice tightened. "We should have been told. They should have told us about any document of value. We raised them. We deserve." "Deserve?" Bruno cut in. "You want to split something that could pay the mortgage? I mean, really, what about our kids? What about the debts?" Their language had an urgency that grew from practical needs. Guilt was a soft, muffled thing in the background, easily excused. None of them had sat with Antonio and Rosa in the narrow light of evenings, listening to the slow inventory of a life. They had not felt the steady humiliation. They took their own hunger to be a justice. When the first of the three returned to the pension, he brought a smile that had been scrubbed at by guilt and ambition. Marcelo arrived with flowers in one hand and an apology rehearsed like a speech. He lingered at the doorway as if uncertain whether to come inside Lourdes's safe circle. "You all right?" he asked, too loudly for the room's small intimacy. Antonio looked at him simply. "We are," he said. "We are kept, thank you." Marcelo's apologies folded into anxieties about the offer. "If this is valuable, we should be compensated. I mean, our name is on the birth certificates. It's our family." Rosa stayed quiet for a while, the kind of silence that is listening without performing. When she spoke, it was soft but deliberate. "We loved you," she said. "We gave what we could. That is not the same as giving up a life's work without a conversation." Patricia arrived the next day with tearful eyes and a small cake that seemed too celebratory for the occasion. She set the cake on the table like a peace offering and spoke of regret between pastry laments. Bruno came last, direct and impatient. He had brought with him a young lawyer he had called, someone who offered faster solutions if the family wanted to push. Together, they made the living room feel like a courtroom and a dinner, a place where bread and dispute sit uncomfortably at the same table. Claudia's offers and Marcelo's tentative performances of sorrow collided with Dr. Renato's insistence on process. "No quick signatures," he said, firm enough to carve space in the room. "No pressure. We will proceed legally. Any deal will go through me." The children tried many approaches: cajoling, bargaining, thinly disguised threats about partial claims, pay-ins to family responsibility. They called the scene at the nursing home an error and the laughter of misremembered thing. They insisted they had been overwhelmed back then, that it was a moment of poor judgment.
They asked for forgiveness, sometimes earnestly, sometimes with the sharp edges of convenience. Antonio had prepared for this in ways he didn't boast about. For months, in the shadows of their last kitchen, he had been writing. He had written letters that were not simply accusations, they were accounts, measured and personal. They were reminders of the night the roof had leaked and he had sewn a tarp over the bed, of the time Rosa had pawned a jewel so the boy could finish a course, of the appointments missed, of the mornings when the children's faces had been bright with possibility and the parents had been shadows at the stove. The letters were not legal instruments. They were moral architecture, plain language that would make the choice between apology and recompense as visible as a doorway. When he placed these 3 folded pages on the kitchen table and told Lourdes and Dr. Renato what he had written, he did not ask for finality. He only asked for dignity, the right to be heard, and the right to decide how any material outcome would be used. "So you'll read them?" asked Rosa in the hush that followed. "Yes," he said, "but not to punish, to explain." The moment of reading did not descend like a courtroom verdict. It was intimate and it was public, and it became the day everything else pivoted. Lourdes fetched a kettle, and the neighbors lined up in chairs as if for a small-town meeting. Jessica, Paulinho, Edilson, and a few others came to witness. Even Anna, the nurse, who had first offered the pension as a path away from the nursing home, came with a plain face and eyes that had watched many things unfold. The siblings arrived, nursing varying degrees of hope and impatience. Each letter was handed across the table like a small petition. Antônio unfolded the first letter and read it aloud. It was addressed to Marcelo. "My son," he began, his voice a grainy rope that steadied as it moved. "I am not writing to make you small. I am writing so you remember the mornings. I remember you when you were lit with a hunger for books, when I saved the coins to buy your first pair of shoes and walked you to school as if the whole town could not hold our pride. We did not leave you with a map of riches. We left you with tools, work, honesty, and the chance to make something of yourself without trampling the hands that held you. If you come now because of money, know the difference. Love is not something that retains with bills. You left us at a gate. I will not let that door close between us entirely, but I will not let my dignity be bought back with apologies spoken where interest is the real motive." Marcelo's face moved through a sequence of expressions: surprise, shame, then the thin mask of pragmatism. He said things about responsibility and family in return, but the letter had already rearranged the air. It made the scales visible. Patricia's letter was tender and steady.
"My daughter," Antonio read after a pause, "you were the one who cried quietly when the wages were low. You were the one who took a sewing machine to mend the frayed hems we thought were a part of life. I do not want to curse you for leaving. I want you to remember the small things, the way your father taught you to tie a rope, the way your mother shaped bread. If return is about giving back, then start by honoring the dignity that was taken from us. You may come now craning sorrow, but sorrow is not a currency. Let your actions be what repairs what was broken." Bruno's letter held a different cadence, practical, unflinching. "My son," the words said, "I know the world asks you to be quick and decisive. I also know that quickness can be a way of hiding the things that ache under the skin. If you want to be part of our life again, show it in the work you do, not in the claims you make. A signed paper that names you as heir will not mend the nights when we waited at the door. If you ask for money first, I will think you came for the wrong reasons." None of the letters closed with vindictive language. They were not traps. They were mirrors, plain as glass. They asked the children to step into an honesty they had avoided. They asked for small, concrete steps: involvement in building something for the elders of the town, a period of reconciliation that included work rather than entitlement, a recognition that property could be used for the public good rather than the private uplift of a few. The siblings reacted in ways that reflected their lives. Marcelo, who had a tendency to perform contrition that could be measured in minutes, promised to come back with help, with ideas, with a negotiation strategy. Patricia burst into tears, some sincere, some perhaps produced by the theater of the moment, and asked for time. Bruno looked away most of the time and calmed his voice as if in the presence of a verdict he had not expected. Later, in the privacy of the kitchen, the conversations turned practical. Dr. Renato laid out options.
put the property into a trust that would create an elder care facility run in collaboration with the town, reserve a life annuity for Antonio and Rosa for their security, set aside funds for Lourdes and Josue for their service, earmark a percentage to build rooms for others who faced the risk of being discarded. The options were legal and grounded. They required consensus and signatures. Antonio and Rosa thought not of revenge, but of form. They had been abandoned physically once. Their response would be to guard their dignity from being monetized again. They chose structure over sudden payouts. They favored a plan that protected them, honored those who had welcomed them, and transformed the secret into something public and sustaining. "Let it help the ones who have nowhere," Rosa said at last. "If we are to be given a chance to turn this into something, let it be a place where nobody is left like a parcel on a stoop."
Renato nodded and began drafting the trust documents. The language was careful. Trustees, beneficiaries, life annuity clauses, distribution schedules, an explanation of the charitable mission for the property's use. There would be a public registry indicating that, under the trust's terms, the property could not be sold for private gain for a certain period. It was a legal bulwark against opportunism. Claudio, it turned out, was not moved by letters. He was moved by contracts. He made one last, generous-sounding offer and requested an expedited sale. When told the property was to be placed in a trust with a community mission, his polite smile softened with the calculation of a man who wanted tidy, uncontested transactions. "If you want a quick resolution," he said, "we can transfer funds now, and you can designate the trust as you wish afterward. It's cleaner for everyone." "No," Antonio answered, and there was no flourish in his voice, only quiet resolve. "We will do this through the registry and through proper channels. We will not risk being hurried into decisions that erase what we have learned." Claudio left with a promise to return with a better offer. He would, as Claudio men often do, see the trust as an obstacle to be negotiated around. In the meantime, his juniors tried quieter tactics: friendly lunches, offers to cover legal fees if the family agreed to a fast sale, appeals to the siblings. But the legal net had been cast, and Dr. Renato, with his tidy office and slow patience, was a difficult fish to catch. As the months unspooled, the town watched. The registry stamped, the surveyors measured, Edelson carried forms, and the neighboring shops whispered about what it meant to transform private wealth into public care. Jessica kept a careful chronicle at the post office, and the radio's little segment on community heroes ran a short feature on Lourdes and the pension. People offered labor, small donations of paint or tiles, and the carpenter who had once repaired Antonio's plow volunteered his crew for a weekend of work when the shelter needed a new door. When a formal proposal came from Vali Construcciones that offered a sum substantial enough to be life-changing, Dr. Renato read it with a practiced eye. It was clean: escrowed funds, a notary's pre-approved clause, a thin apologetic clause about previous developments. He sat across from Antonio and Rosa in the kitchen light and said what had become his adjudication rule: "Decide what you want your life to be, not what others want to make of it." They decided. They accepted the offer on conditions. The sale would be transparent and legally binding. A percentage would be set aside in the trust for the operation of a community elder house and daily support. An immediate sum would be allocated to purchase a modest bungalow near the pension for Antonio and Rosa, where they could live without fear of being moved for convenience.
A stipend would be set for Lourdes and Josue for their continued care and work in the shelter. Another portion would seed a small fund for the town to offer emergency assistance to elders in need. The trust charter stipulated that no direct distribution to descendants would be made for 5 years, allowing for a period of demonstrated reconnection and restitution if any children were to show genuine, sustained care. The signatures required witnesses. The same neighbor who had once signed as a witness for a small sale now sat at a polished desk in the registry office and watched Dr. Renato's pen move through legal corridors. The cartorio stamped. Claudio's money, when it arrived into escrow, was less like manna than municipal paperwork, formal, slow, and obedient to the rhythms of law. Antonio watched the ink dry as if it were the setting of something permanent and, for once, non-negotiable. It was not an instant redemption. The money did not bloom overnight into a solution. There were taxes, notaries, and the niggling minutiae of bureaucracy, additional surveys because the developer's own planners wanted to ensure boundaries, a minor dispute from a distant cousin who, on seeing the sums, remembered a story his grandfather had told of a land deed and demanded clarification. Dr. Renato handled the paperwork with the same deliberate patience he had asked of them in the beginning. When the trust was formally established, they held a small ceremony in the pension's kitchen. It was not a press release. It was a table with too many chairs and a kettle singing softly over the stove. Lourdes cut a strip of blue string to mark the first cooperative meeting. She joked in a voice that was half laughter and half relief. "We will be careful with what we build. No marble palaces, just warm rooms, good soup, and dignity." The opening day of the newly renovated community wing, the Beira House, as the town named it after the old Cita de Beira, arrived with the plain festival of people who sew their own happiness together. The ribbon was an old scarf, the scissors borrowed from the tailor. The mayor came with a speech polished by civic carefulness. Claudio sent a small bottle of champagne tucked among glossy pamphlets. The children were invited, but not required to be honored guests. Marcelo showed up with a bouquet, but kept his distance. Patricia's eyes were red. Bruno did not speak much, and hovered near a doorway, as if beside a stage whose script he did not yet know. When Lourdes handed the symbolic key to Antônio and Rosa, the applause that rose was not loud, but it was honest. Jessica cried quietly into a handkerchief. Paulinho clapped with hands that had been used to fieldwork, and Adilson gave a proud young smile. The first resident of the wing was an old widow who had been sleeping on a church bench. She slid inside like someone moving into a bed that had been waiting years.
The shelter had 3 rooms, a communal kitchen with steady pots, and a small garden where Antonio insisted on planting figs because they had once marked the property's edge. He planted them with a certain ceremony, his hands in the soil, Rosa beside him, the town around sharing shovels and songs. The distribution of funds was careful and public. Lourdes received enough to secure the pension's future and to hire an assistant so she could rest more. Josue was given a modest stipend, plus an investment in his truck, so that he could continue driving people to appointments and hauling materials for the shelter without worry. A community board, comprised of neighbors, a representative from the municipal office, and Dr. Renato, oversaw the trust's disbursements. The fund was planned on a conservative estimate, so it would not evaporate on good intentions and poor accounting. The siblings did not disappear entirely. Marcelo tried to step into a role as volunteer liaison, offering to handle some paperwork pro bono for a few months. Patricia came with a cake and a pile of hand-me-down linens. Bruno's involvement was sporadic, more visible when the media came, and less tangible when the work required steady hands. None of their returns were immediately rewarded with legal money. Dr. Renato's clause was explicit. Reconciliation required time, demonstrated service, and notations in the trust's records. The children could be part of the work if they chose, but they would not be entitled to immediate payouts. Small reconciliations took place. Patricia helped organize a small sewing group for women at the shelter, and in doing so she found herself sitting beside elders whose hands had once shown her father's work ethic. Her demeanor softened as she discovered layers of the life she had never been asked to see. Marcelo contributed a spreadsheet for budgeting that proved unexpectedly useful and began to visit more consistently, bringing with him the humility that comes from balanced accounting. Bruno, who had been the most resistant, came once to fix a broken step and left with a shy pride that surprised him. None of these moves were absolution. They were small acts of repair. There was, however, a more tender reconciliation that neither law nor ledger could have anticipated. Patricia's son, Antônio and Rosa's grandchild, began to come regularly, an innocent presence whose affection was not yet packed with the complicated cargo adults carry. He would slip into the shelter and sit at the kids' table, drawing for the elders, humming songs that Rosa taught him. With time, his presence became a kind of bridge. He loved his grandparents with the uncomplicated fidelity of a child, and in that love he invited his mother to remember lessons of a life built in hands. One afternoon, as the shelter's garden grew in a small geometry of fig leaves and tomato vines, the town organized a small party to give thanks. People brought things that fit in their hands, a jar of jam, a woven basket, a song. The naive ribbon was gone. In its place were the heat-scarred hands that had patted stucco and hammered nails. Antonio watched children play under the fig tree and felt, with a gentle conviction, the weight of a life rebalanced, not by money, but by choice. "You did what you said you would," Rosa told him one evening as they sat on the bungalow's narrow porch. Their new house was modest. It had a small kitchen that smelled of rosemary and a window that looked toward the shelter that had become their neighbor. It was theirs by right and by law, and the security felt like a warm well to drink from after a long thirst. "We did it our way," he answered, thinking of the gate and the laughter, and the months of slow, careful work. He had not wanted to make enemies of his children. He had wanted to make space for them to return if they chose, with their sleeves rolled up and real apologies in hand. That choice had been his, and he had used the secret to build something that refused to let someone else's thoughtless cruelty repeat itself. The Beta house settled into its life as a place where dignity mattered. The routine was practical: a morning stretch, breakfast with the neighbors, a small group that met to share stories of the past and practical advice for the present. The Trust's board met monthly with minutes and a clear budget. A nurse volunteered one afternoon a week, and the town's baker, who had once been helped by Antonio's quick hands in a lean season, arranged a small delivery of day-old bread each morning so no one would begin the day hungry. Months melted into a year and then into another. The prosecutorial urgency of the first headlines quieted. Claudio's company moved its attention to another project where the politics bend more easily to their favor. He did not win the parcel he had hoped for, but in the world of property developers, disappointment is often a roundabout that rarely feels like humiliation. It is rather a lesson in profit redirection. The siblings found ways to be involved, but not to appropriate. Marcelo visited more soberly, bringing financial plans not to take the trust down, but to suggest sustainable investments. Patricia learned to measure care in hours rather than in confessions. Bruno stayed off social media for a while and found his hands useful in mending things, slowly letting the muscle memory of work repair his conscience. None asked for the old life back. The old life for them was complicated beyond reduction to nostalgia. For Antonio and Rosa, the life they had chosen was different from anything they'd imagined in their younger years, less about survival nuance and more about the freedom to choose where to place their care. They slept with a contentment that was no longer brittle.
Their mornings were marked now by the laughter of the grandchildren and by the knowledge that a small group of elders had rooms where music played and tea was hot. There were quieter victories that did not make the local paper. The woman who had once slept on a church bench learned to bake rolls and sold them to neighbors. A man who had been evicted years before found a small bed in the shelter, and after several months of steady help, began to volunteer at the market stall where he once worked. A lonely widow found company in the sewing circle and told stories of her own father, who had once owned tools, and laughed in a way that left lines of light around her eyes. Those changes meant more to Antonio than the numbers ever could. On a clear night, under a sky that had marked so many of their conversations, Antonio and Rosa sat on their small porch, the bungalow's lamp spilling a soft pool of light. The town's distant murmur was a lullaby. They had kept fidelity to what mattered, not wealth as a trophy, but security as a choice. Their neighbors' footsteps passed by in measured rhythms, and now those steps often included the slow walk of added companions, elders who had found a second home, volunteers who had become family. "I never thought we'd have figs again," Antonio said, running his thumb along a small leaf. The tree had grown enough to shade their porch a little. "You know, I liked the idea that small things last." Rosa tilted her head and smiled, in the almost private way she had always smiled when seeing the beauty in some overlooked detail. "We planted the tree so others could sit in its shade," she said, "but it's nice to have fruit too." They spoke of softer things, the shape of grandchildren's laughter, the taste of soup that brought someone back to the table, the rare but real apologies that arrived like small gifts. There were no tidy reconciliations with the past. The children remained complex people with their own lives and needs. But the presence of a grandson who climbed up the step with sticky fingers and a laugh that matched his grandmother's face made the world feel full in a way that mended, in increments, what had been torn. "You were right about letters," Antonio said suddenly, voice low. "Not to use them as weapons. They are a map." Rosa reached and took his hand, fingers finding the familiar grooves. "They were a way to show what we could not say in a single moment," she replied. "They showed what we couldn't give again, and what we could choose to give." Outside, a small group met under the fig tree to plan a series of workshops for the elderly, literacy classes, a small cooperative to sell preserves, a day each week for crafts. The town's energy had shifted from gossip to a practical kindness that required commitment.
That was the real test, whether compassion became activity. At the edge of the garden, Edelson had dragged out an old radio and a battered chair and set them as a listening spot.
He learned, in the process of carrying forms and fuel, that doing small things every day builds the scaffolding for larger ones. Years later, years seasoned with small, patient victories, the shelter would be cited in a paper that focused on community-driven initiatives. People from other towns would come to learn. Antônio would be asked to sit on a panel and speak about dignity and the slow work of repair. He would speak, as he had written in his letters, about the mornings and the smallness of apologies. He would not make enemies of his children in the telling, but would insist with a steady and plain voice that the moral of their story was not legal technicality, but the stubborn insistence that elders are people, not parcels. On the night before the shelter's 5th anniversary, Antônio and Rosa walked the grounds together. The lamplight softened the walls and the figs rustled like soft applause. Children's drawings were taped to the inside of the dining room door, and a photograph of the first day, their hands, the old scarf, the neighbor's smile, hung in the entrance as if to say, "These are the small beginnings that matter." They sat for a long time on the bench by the garden. The years had smoothed the harsh edge of memory without erasing it. The laughter at the gate would remain as a lesson rather than a wound. They had turned a secret kept in a leather folder into something public and sustaining. Their riches, if riches is what one calls a carefully guarded dignity, had been used to lift others rather than punish those who had failed them. Rosa leaned her head on Antonio's shoulder and looked up at the sky, the stars sharp and indifferent and comforting. "We've earned the right to be quiet now," she said. "No," he corrected gently. "We've earned the right to speak when it matters." She smiled in the dark, small and knowing. "And to plant figs." He laughed softly. "And to eat them when they're ripe." Between the soft sounds of the town and the deeper, unchanged hum of the world, there was a simple sense that their life, once treated like a thing to be set aside, had been reclaimed as purpose. They had chosen to make their legacy a place for people who might otherwise be discarded. They had refused to let indignity be the final note in their story. It is not always immediate, the work of restoring dignity. It is slow as law, slow as planting, slow as the careful knitting of a town that remembers what it owes to the hands that feed it. But the slow thing grows roots. In the end, Antônio and Rosa would say that they had not hidden a secret to hoard it. They had hidden it as a promise, and when the world finally listened, they turned that promise into rooms where names were spoken aloud and where no one would be left on a doorstep because others found them inconvenient. If this story moved you, share it. There are elders everywhere who need hearts that know how to see them.